My name is Savannah Mitchell, and I'm 25 years old. Sitting in this sterile hospital waiting room on Christmas Eve, staring at the chair where my mother drew her last breath alone, I knew something was terribly wrong. My father Harrison had just returned with coffee and tears streaming down his face, claiming traffic through the snowstorm had delayed him. But his clothes were completely dry, and Mom's final text message on her phone made my blood run cold. "He knows I found the papers." The nurses avoided my eyes, and I realized my perfect father might be a monster. Before we dive into this devastating story of family betrayal and hidden truth, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story resonates with you or you want to hear how I uncovered the shocking conspiracy that destroyed my family, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of survival and justice. Trust me, what I discovered about my father will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Growing up, everyone in our small Connecticut town envied the Mitchell family. Dad Harrison was the successful insurance company owner who coached Little League on weekends, while Mom Catherine volunteered at the church bake sales with her warm smile that could light up any room. We lived in a beautiful colonial house with white picket fences, literally the American dream come to life. But looking back now, I can see the cracks in that perfect facade that I was too young and trusting to recognize. Harrison Mitchell was what people called a pillar of the community. His insurance firm, Mitchell Family Protection Services, had been helping local families for over 15 years. He drove the newest BMW, wore expensive suits, and always had a firm handshake and winning smile for everyone he met. At church functions and neighborhood barbecues, he would wrap his arm around Mom's waist possessively while regaling crowds with stories of his business trips to Chicago and New York. Everyone admired how dedicated he was to providing for his family through all that travel. But behind closed doors, things were different. Mom had this nervous habit of checking the clock whenever Dad was expected home, rushing around to make sure dinner was perfectly prepared and the house was spotless. If Dad found even a dish in the sink or a magazine left on the coffee table, he wouldn't raise his voice or throw things like other abusive husbands. Instead, he would give Mom this disappointed look and make comments about how hard he worked to provide for a family that couldn't appreciate his efforts. Over the years, I watched as Mom's circle of friends grew smaller and smaller. Dad had a way of making subtle comments about her friends during dinner conversations. Mrs. Henderson from next door was clearly jealous of what we have, while Mom's college roommate Sarah was obviously going through a midlife crisis and not the kind of influence our family needs. He never directly forbade Mom from seeing anyone, but he had this talent for making her feel guilty about every friendship, every coffee date, every phone call that took time away from family. Catherine Mitchell had once been a vibrant woman who taught kindergarten and painted watercolor landscapes in her spare time. But gradually, she stopped mentioning her teaching colleagues, stopped painting, stopped laughing the way she used to when Dad wasn't around. When I asked her about it during my teenage years, she would just smile sadly and say that priorities change when you become a wife and mother. My brother Tucker, 3 years older than me, seemed to understand the family dynamics in a way that I didn't. He learned early to stay quiet during Dad's subtle criticisms of Mom, to nod along when Dad explained why certain family decisions had to be made a certain way. Tucker got a car for his 16th birthday, generous allowances, and Dad's approval for playing varsity football. I realize now that Dad was grooming Tucker to be his ally, teaching him that keeping Mom isolated was normal, even necessary for family harmony. The business trips became more frequent as I got older. Dad would be gone for weeks at a time, expanding the insurance company to new markets across New England. Mom would seem to relax during these periods, humming while she cooked, calling old friends, even taking up painting again. But the moment Dad's car pulled into the driveway, that light in her eyes would dim, and she'd become that nervous, careful version of herself again. What I didn't understand then was that Dad's protection of our family extended to controlling every aspect of Mom's life. He managed all the household finances, claiming that his business background made him better suited for such responsibilities. Mom had to ask permission for any purchase over $20, and Dad would review all the grocery receipts to ensure she wasn't being wasteful with his hard-earned money. The medical issues started about 3 years ago. Mom began experiencing fatigue, dizziness, and what she described as episodes where she felt like her blood sugar was dropping. Dad immediately took charge, finding her a doctor, scheduling appointments, and insisting on being present during every visit. Dr. Clayton Morse was Dad's golf buddy and diagnosed Mom with adult-onset diabetes, prescribing insulin and dietary restrictions. Looking back, I should have questioned why a woman who had never shown any signs of diabetes would suddenly develop such severe symptoms. I should have wondered why Dad was so insistent on managing her medications himself, organizing her pills in weekly containers and reminding her constantly about proper dosages. But Dad had always been the take-charge type, and I actually admired how attentively he cared for Mom's health. The first real betrayal came 6 months ago, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was helping Mom clean out the medicine cabinet when I found 3 full bottles of her insulin medication in the trash. When I asked Dad about it, he explained that the pharmacy had given them an outdated prescription and he'd thrown them away for safety reasons. It seemed reasonable enough, but Mom looked confused and said she didn't remember the medications being expired. That same week, I discovered that Mom had been keeping a journal hidden in our garden shed. She had always loved that little space among her rose bushes, claiming it helped her think and find peace. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman who felt trapped and increasingly afraid. She wrote about feeling like she was losing her mind, forgetting conversations and appointments that she was certain she had remembered correctly. She described feeling watched and controlled, but doubted her own perceptions because Dad was always so reasonable and caring when she brought up her concerns. The most disturbing entries were from the past few months, where Mom described feeling sick after taking her insulin, experiencing symptoms that seemed more severe than anything Dr. Morse had warned her about. She had started suspecting that something was wrong with her medications, but Dad always had explanations. Maybe she was taking them at the wrong time, maybe she needed to adjust her diet more strictly, maybe the stress of her condition was making everything seem worse than it really was. Reading those journal entries felt like watching my mother disappear slowly, doubting her own reality while the man who claimed to love her most gradually erased the person she had once been. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to believe that my father was deliberately harming her. Harrison Mitchell was respected in our community, successful in his business, and had never raised a hand to anyone in his life. The idea that he might be slowly poisoning his own wife seemed like something out of a television drama, not real life. But now, sitting in this hospital waiting room where Mom died alone, those journal entries felt like warning signs I had been too naive and trusting to heed. 3 days before Christmas, everything changed. I was finishing my shift at the local bookstore where I worked part-time while taking online college courses when Dad called, his voice tight with panic. Mom had collapsed at home and he was rushing her to Hartford General Hospital. By the time I arrived, she was already admitted to the cardiac wing, and Dad was pacing the waiting room like a man possessed with grief. Dr. Frederick Walsh, the head of cardiology, emerged from the elevator with grave news. Mom had suffered what appeared to be a severe cardiac event, complicated by her diabetes. Her condition was critical but stable, and they were running extensive tests to determine the best course of treatment. Dad nodded solemnly, asking all the right questions about treatment options and prognosis, playing the role of devoted husband perfectly. But something felt off about the whole situation. When I asked to see Mom, Dad gently but firmly explained that she was heavily sedated and wouldn't recognize visitors. Walsh confirmed that family visits should be limited to allow her body to focus on recovery. Dad would handle all communication with the medical staff, he assured me, and would call immediately if there were any changes in her condition. The next morning, I called the hospital directly to check on Mom's status. The nurse who answered, a woman named Ruth Bradford, seemed confused when I identified myself as Catherine Mitchell's daughter. She mentioned that there had been some unusual requests regarding visiting restrictions for my mother's room, but she couldn't provide specific details over the phone. When I asked what she meant by unusual, she hesitated and then said she would need to speak with the attending physician before discussing my mother's case further. That afternoon, Dad sat me down for what he called an important family conversation. He explained that he had been in contact with our extended family, letting them know about Mom's condition. Aunt Linda, Mom's sister from Oregon, wouldn't be able to make the trip due to her own health issues. Uncle Robert was dealing with his elderly mother and couldn't travel during the holidays. Dad had advised everyone that visits would be too stressful for Mom in her current condition, and it would be better to wait until after the new year when she was hopefully recovering at home. Something about Dad's explanation didn't sit right with me. Aunt Linda had always been incredibly close to Mom, and I knew she would move heaven and earth to be here if she thought her sister was dying. I decided to call her myself, only to discover that Dad had told her Mom's condition was minor, a small episode related to her diabetes that doctors expected to resolve quickly with rest and medication adjustment. When I confronted Dad about the discrepancy, he looked genuinely puzzled and explained that he had been trying to manage everyone's stress levels during an already difficult holiday season. He didn't want Aunt Linda to panic unnecessarily, especially since doctors were optimistic about Mom's recovery. It seemed reasonable, even thoughtful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Dad was managing information rather than sharing it honestly. On Christmas Eve morning, I insisted on visiting Mom regardless of the visiting restrictions. Dad reluctantly agreed to drive me to the hospital, but when we arrived, the security guard, a kind-looking older man named Javier Santos, apologetically explained that I wasn't on the approved visitor list for room 314. Only immediate family with specific authorization could see Mrs. Mitchell, and my name wasn't in the system. Dad looked as surprised as I felt, immediately launching into an explanation about how there must be some administrative error. He spoke to Javier in low, urgent tones while I stood nearby, frustrated and increasingly suspicious. After several minutes, Dad returned with the news that hospital policy required 24 hours notice to add new names to critical patient visitor lists, but he would make sure I was added first thing the next morning. The whole situation felt surreal. I was standing 10 feet away from my dying mother, blocked by hospital policies that seemed designed to keep family members apart during the most critical moments. Dad suggested we go home and return the next day when the paperwork would be properly processed, but something in his demeanor made me want to stay and fight the bureaucracy. While Dad went to speak with the nursing supervisor, I struck up a conversation with Mom's roommate, an elderly woman named Gladys Porter who was recovering from hip surgery. Mrs. Porter was sharp and observant, and what she told me sent chills down my spine. According to her, Mom had been alert and asking for me repeatedly over the past 2 days. She had tried to use the room phone several times to call me directly, but kept being told by nursing staff that the phone wasn't working properly. Mrs. Porter also mentioned that Dad had visited multiple times, always alone, and always insisted on speaking privately with Mom. During these visits, Mrs. Porter noticed that Mom would become agitated and upset, though she couldn't hear the specific conversations. On one occasion, she heard Mom crying and saying something about papers and evidence, but Dad's voice remained calm and soothing throughout their exchange. The most disturbing detail Mrs. Porter shared was that Mom had asked her to call me on Christmas Eve morning, giving her my phone number and begging her to tell me that Dad was lying about her condition. But when Mrs. Porter tried to call, she was told by a nurse that patients weren't allowed to make phone calls on behalf of other patients, and she risked losing her visiting privileges if she violated hospital communication policies. When Dad returned with news that we would need to come back tomorrow due to administrative complications, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where hospital policies and bureaucratic procedures were being weaponized to keep me away from my mother. Dad's explanation was perfectly reasonable, his frustration seemed genuine, and his concern for Mom appeared authentic. But Mrs. Porter's account suggested that Mom was neither unconscious nor unable to receive visitors. That evening, as we drove home through the Christmas Eve snow, Dad received a call on his cell phone. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but his tone was urgent and professional, not the voice of a man dealing with his wife's medical crisis. He mentioned timing, schedules, and something about making sure everything was handled properly before morning. When I asked who was calling about business matters on Christmas Eve, Dad explained that insurance emergencies don't respect holidays, and he was coordinating coverage for a client's family who had been in a car accident. At 11:30 that night, Dad announced that he was going back to the hospital to check on Mom one more time before Christmas morning. I offered to come with him, but he insisted that I stay home and try to get some rest. The roads were getting dangerous, and there was no point in both of us losing sleep over what would probably be a brief visit just to ensure she was comfortable. Dad left the house at midnight, and I spent the next 4 hours pacing our living room, unable to sleep or settle down. Something about the entire situation felt orchestrated, like a carefully planned performance where I was the unwitting audience rather than a participant in my own family's medical crisis. At 4:15 a.m., Dad called to tell me that Mom had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her heart had simply stopped, Dr. Walsh explained, a not uncommon outcome for diabetic patients who suffer severe cardiac events. Dad's voice was broken with grief, but there was something underneath his sorrow that sounded almost like relief. When I arrived back at the hospital, Dad was sitting in the same waiting room chair where this nightmare had started, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, holding a cup of coffee with steady hands while tears streamed down his face. But his clothes were completely dry despite the heavy snow that had been falling all night, and when I hugged him, he didn't smell like the cold winter air that should have clung to anyone who had rushed through a storm to be with their dying loved one. The funeral arrangements consumed the next week, and Dad threw himself into organizing every detail with an efficiency that bordered on obsessive. He selected the casket, chose the flowers, wrote the obituary, and scheduled the service, all while maintaining the demeanor of a heartbroken widower who was somehow finding strength to honor his beloved wife's memory. But I couldn't stop thinking about that final text message on Mom's phone and what papers she might have found. While Dad met with the funeral director, I began searching through Mom's personal belongings, looking for any clue about what she might have discovered that made her feel unsafe. In the bottom drawer of her jewelry box, underneath old photos and birthday cards, I found a small silver key that I didn't recognize. It was attached to a strip of tape with numbers written in Mom's careful handwriting, First National, 847. The key led me to a safety deposit box at First National Bank that I never knew existed. According to the bank records, Mom had opened the box 6 months ago under her maiden name, Catherine Williams. The contents of that box shattered every assumption I had made about my parents' marriage and my father's character. Inside were copies of divorce papers that Mom had been secretly preparing with an attorney named Douglas Sterling. The legal documents outlined a plan for Mom to leave Dad, citing emotional abuse, financial control, and growing fears for her physical safety. But more shocking were the financial records Mom had somehow obtained, showing that Dad's insurance business was built on a foundation of fraud that stretched back over a decade. Harrison Mitchell had been systematically defrauding clients by collecting premiums for policies that didn't exist, using his charm and reputation to convince customers that their coverage was secure while funneling their money into personal accounts. The documentation showed patterns of targeting elderly clients and families going through difficult transitions, people who trusted Dad's expertise and rarely questioned the complex financial arrangements he proposed. But the most devastating discovery was a manila envelope marked personal insurance, in Mom's handwriting. Inside were photographs of Dad with a woman I didn't recognize, taken outside a luxury apartment complex in downtown Hartford. The woman was young, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair and a prominent pregnant belly. The timestamp on the photos showed they were taken just 2 weeks before Mom's death. There were also printed emails between Dad and this woman, whose name was Adriana Blackwood. Their correspondence revealed a relationship that had been going on for over 2 years, with Dad promising to marry her as soon as he could resolve the situation with his current wife. In one particularly disturbing email, Dad assured Adriana that Catherine's health problems were getting worse and that nature would likely solve their problem without any intervention on their part. The safety deposit box also contained audio recordings that Mom had made using her smartphone. These were conversations between her and Dad where she confronted him about his business trips and the increasing amounts of money that seemed to be missing from their joint accounts. Dad's responses on these recordings revealed a manipulative pattern where he would turn every question around, making Mom doubt her own observations and feel guilty for not trusting her husband. In one recording, Mom asked Dad directly about Adriana Blackwood, explaining that she had found credit card charges for expensive jewelry and women's clothing that clearly weren't for her. Dad's response was chilling in its calculated cruelty. He told Mom that her diabetes was affecting her memory and judgment, that she was becoming paranoid and irrational, and that her accusations were symptoms of her declining mental state. The final item in the safety deposit box was a letter addressed to me, sealed but dated just 1 week before Mom's death. In the letter, she explained that she had been documenting Dad's behavior for months, gathering evidence of his financial crimes and building a case for divorce. She had discovered that Dad's business partner had been pressuring him about missing client funds, and she believed Dad was planning to use her life insurance policy to cover his fraudulent activities. Most terrifying was Mom's description of her growing suspicion that Dad was deliberately making her sicker. She had started secretly testing her blood sugar levels and discovered that the insulin Dad prepared for her was causing dangerous fluctuations that didn't match her actual dietary intake. She had scheduled an appointment with a different doctor, planning to get independent medical testing, but died before she could follow through. The letter ended with Mom's plea that if anything happened to her, should investigate her death thoroughly and not let Dad control the narrative. She had hidden copies of all her evidence with attorney Douglas Sterling, along with instructions for how to contact him safely. She also warned me that Dad had been involving my brother Tucker in his schemes, using Tucker's gambling debts to ensure his silence and cooperation. Learning about Tucker's involvement felt like a second betrayal, almost as devastating as discovering Dad's true nature. Tucker had accumulated serious gambling debts during his sophomore year of college, money that Dad had quietly paid off in exchange for Tucker's promise not to interfere with family business. Tucker knew about Adriana, knew about the insurance fraud, and had stayed silent while Mom became increasingly isolated and sick. When I confronted Tucker privately, expecting denials and explanations, he broke down completely. He admitted that Dad had shown him evidence of the affair months ago, framing it as a situation that would be resolved quietly without hurting Mom. Dad had convinced Tucker that Mom's health was declining naturally, and that it would be cruel to burden her with knowledge about Adriana during her final months. Tucker also revealed that Dad had been pressuring him to encourage Mom to increase her insurance coverage, presenting it as a way to ensure the family's financial security if her health continued to deteriorate. Tucker had reluctantly participated in these conversations, helping Dad convince Mom that larger life insurance policies were a responsible precaution for someone with serious medical conditions. The scope of Dad's deception was staggering. He had spent years positioning himself as the perfect husband while systematically destroying Mom's independence, health, and ultimately her life. He had manipulated medical professionals, financial institutions, and even his own children to create an elaborate framework that would allow him to commit murder while appearing to be a grieving victim. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that this pattern extended beyond our family. The financial records Mom had gathered suggested that Dad's insurance fraud had been victimizing families throughout Connecticut for years. The money he was stealing wasn't just being used to fund his affair with Adriana, it was supporting a lifestyle that none of us had realized was built on other people's financial ruin. As I sat in our family living room, surrounded by condolence cards and funeral flowers, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my father was a carefully constructed lie. Harrison Mitchell wasn't a successful businessman who had lost his beloved wife to a tragic illness. He was a predator who had spent years grooming his family and community to provide cover for increasingly serious crimes. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Mom was already gone, and Dad's performance as the grieving widower was convincing enough that no one in our community suspected anything unusual about her death. Challenging his narrative would require evidence that could stand up to scrutiny, allies who would support my claims against a respected community member, and the courage to destroy whatever remained of our family's reputation. But sitting there holding Mom's final letter, I knew I had no choice but to fight for justice, even if it meant exposing everything about our family to public scrutiny and potentially destroying my relationship with Tucker forever. My investigation into the hospital's role in Mom's death revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Dad's individual manipulation. As I dug deeper into the events of Christmas Eve, I discovered that Dad's ability to control Mom's final hours wasn't just a matter of exploiting hospital policies, it was the result of carefully cultivated relationships with key staff members who owed him various favors. Dr. Frederick Walsh, the head of cardiology who had treated Mom, turned out to have a financial relationship with Dad that went back several years. Through public records and some careful investigation, I learned that Dr. Walsh had invested heavily in a real estate development project that had gone bankrupt, leaving him with substantial personal debts. Dad's insurance company had provided coverage for the failed project, and when claims were filed, Dad had helped arrange generous settlements that allowed Dr. Walsh to minimize his financial losses. This relationship created a perfect storm of obligation and opportunity when Mom was admitted to Hartford General. Dar. Walsh wasn't necessarily aware that Dad was murdering his wife, but he was willing to accommodate Dad's requests regarding visiting restrictions, communication protocols, and medical privacy without asking too many questions. The nursing staff presented a more complex situation. Ruth Bradford, the nurse who had seemed confused about the visiting restrictions, turned out to be the one honest voice in a system that had been compromised through threats and manipulation rather than bribery. When I approached her privately, Ruth revealed that she had been ordered by hospital administration to limit communications between Mom and outside family members, with the explanation that Mr. Mitchell was handling all family coordination to reduce stress on the patient. Ruth had found these instructions unusual, especially since Mom appeared alert and specifically requested to call me multiple times. But when Ruth questioned the policy with her supervisor, she was told that challenging family communication decisions could result in disciplinary action or termination. As a single mother supporting 2 young children, Ruth couldn't risk her job over hospital policies that seemed unreasonable but not illegal. The security guard, Javier Santos, provided another piece of the puzzle. Javier explained that he had received specific instructions from hospital administration about Mrs. Mitchell's visitor restrictions, with a list of approved individuals that included only Harrison Mitchell. When I asked Javier who had provided these instructions, he showed me paperwork signed by the hospital's patient services coordinator, a woman named Linda Crawford. Linda Crawford, it turned out, was the sister-in-law of Dr. Clayton Morse, the family physician who had been treating Mom's diabetes. Dar. Morse had a long-standing friendship with Dad through their golf club membership and had been prescribing Mom's insulin medication based on Dad's reports of her symptoms rather than independent medical testing. The connections formed a closed loop of professional relationships and personal obligations that Dad had been cultivating for years. He hadn't needed to bribe anyone or make direct threats. Instead, he had positioned himself as a helpful community member who could provide financial services, insurance advice, and professional referrals to people throughout the healthcare system. When Mom was hospitalized, Dad was able to activate this network by presenting her case as a family situation requiring sensitive handling. He convinced Dr. Walsh that Mom was emotionally fragile and that limiting outside stress was medically necessary. He persuaded Linda Crawford that coordinating family communications through one person was more efficient for hospital staff. He assured Dr. Morse that managing Mom's diabetes medication during hospitalization was a continuation of their established treatment relationship. None of these individual requests appeared suspicious in isolation. Hospital staff deal with complicated family dynamics regularly, and Dad's approach seemed thoughtful and organized rather than controlling. But together, these accommodations created a perfect environment for isolating Mom during her final days. The most damning evidence came from the hospital's internal security system. While I couldn't access the footage directly, a private investigator I had hired was able to confirm that cameras had recorded Dad's movements throughout the hospital during the 3 days Mom was a patient. According to the investigator's preliminary report, Dad had made multiple visits to Mom's room outside of normal visiting hours, often staying for extended periods when the nursing staff was occupied with other patients. Medical records also revealed inconsistencies in Mom's treatment that became clear only when examined closely. The insulin levels in Mom's blood work showed dramatic fluctuations that didn't correspond to her documented meal times or medication schedule. Her cardiac symptoms appeared suddenly and severely, without the gradual decline that doctors would expect from someone with her medical history. Most significantly, the medical examiner who had signed Mom's death certificate, a woman named Beatrice Crane, had processed the paperwork unusually quickly for a case involving someone who had no prior history of serious heart disease. Typically, sudden cardiac events in relatively young patients trigger additional testing and investigation, but Mom's case had been classified as a predictable outcome of her diabetic condition. When I requested copies of all medical records related to Mom's hospitalization and death, I discovered that several key documents were missing or incomplete. The nursing notes from Mom's final night were minimal, suggesting either poor documentation or deliberate omissions. The toxicology report that should have been routine for any sudden death had been waived due to her known medical conditions. Dr. Walsh's treatment notes focused heavily on Mom's diabetic complications rather than conducting comprehensive cardiac testing that might have revealed other causes for her symptoms. The overall medical documentation painted a picture of a patient whose death was unfortunate but not unexpected, despite the fact that Mom had been showing signs of improvement just days before her cardiac event. The hospital's internal investigation protocols, which should have been triggered by any unexpected death, had been bypassed through a combination of Dr. Walsh's medical authority and Dad's presentation of Mom's case as a clear instance of diabetic complications. No one had questioned whether additional factors might be involved because Dad's narrative was so convincing and his relationships with key staff members were so well established. What made this conspiracy particularly effective was that it didn't require anyone to knowingly participate in murder. Dr. Walsh believed he was accommodating a devoted husband's reasonable requests for privacy. Ruth Bradford thought she was following hospital policy to reduce patient stress. Javier Santos was enforcing visitor restrictions that appeared to be medically justified. Even Linda Crawford and Dr. Morse genuinely believed they were helping a family navigate a difficult medical crisis by streamlining communication and maintaining continuity of care. Dad's manipulation was so subtle and his reputation so solid that each person felt they were making appropriate professional decisions rather than enabling a crime. The realization that Mom had died surrounded by people who thought they were helping her, while the person she trusted most was deliberately ending her life, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. The hospital staff weren't evil, they were simply outmaneuvered by someone who understood their professional vulnerabilities and personal relationships better than they understood his true intentions. But this network of well-meaning accomplices also represented an opportunity. If I could demonstrate to these individuals how their reasonable actions had been manipulated to enable murder, they might be willing to cooperate with an investigation that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The challenge would be presenting evidence convincingly enough to overcome their natural defensive reactions and professional loyalty to colleagues who had unknowingly helped a murderer destroy his wife. Building a case against Dad required finding people brave enough to challenge a respected community member based on evidence that would seem incredible to anyone who hadn't experienced his manipulation firsthand. My first ally came from an unexpected source, Douglas Sterling, the attorney Mom had been working with to prepare her divorce. Mr. Sterling was a small-town lawyer who specialized in family law, but he had handled enough domestic abuse cases to recognize the patterns in Mom's situation. When I contacted him using the information from Mom's safety deposit box, he was both relieved and terrified to hear from me. He had been expecting Mom to call after Christmas to finalize the divorce paperwork, and her sudden death had left him unsure whether to contact the family or maintain attorney-client confidentiality. The evidence Mom had provided to Mr. Sterling was even more extensive than what I had found in the safety deposit box. She had been methodically documenting Dad's behavior for over 8 months, including financial records that proved his insurance fraud, photographs and emails that documented his affair with Adriana, and detailed logs of incidents that demonstrated his pattern of emotional abuse and control. Most importantly, Mom had provided Mr. Sterling with medical records from an independent physician she had consulted secretly. Dr. Sarah Chen, an endocrinologist in Springfield, had conducted blood tests that revealed Mom's diabetes had been completely mismanaged, with insulin levels that suggested either extreme medical incompetence or deliberate poisoning. Dr. Chen's report indicated that Mom's symptoms were consistent with insulin overdosing rather than natural diabetic complications. The dramatic blood sugar fluctuations, the episodes of confusion and weakness, and the cardiac stress that ultimately killed her were all predictable results of insulin manipulation by someone who understood how to create life-threatening medical crises. Armed with this medical evidence, Mr. Sterling helped me approach Ruth Bradford, the nurse who had seemed uncomfortable with the visiting restrictions during Mom's hospitalization. Ruth was initially reluctant to discuss hospital policies with outsiders, but when we showed her Dr. Chen's medical analysis, she realized that she had witnessed something much more serious than family communication preferences. Ruth agreed to review her own nursing notes from Mom's final days, and what she discovered supported our theory about Dad's involvement in Mom's death. Her records showed that Mom's condition had been improving steadily until Christmas Eve, when her insulin requirements suddenly spiked and her cardiac symptoms became severe. More significantly, Ruth remembered that Dad had been present in Mom's room during several medication administration periods, explaining that he wanted to ensure proper dosing consistency with Mom's home care routine. Ruth had found this level of family involvement unusual but touching, since most relatives preferred to stay out of the way during medical procedures. Looking back with the knowledge of Dad's true intentions, Ruth realized that she had unknowingly provided him with opportunities to interfere with Mom's medication administration. Dad's presence during insulin injections would have given him chances to alter dosages or introduce additional medications that wouldn't be detected during routine monitoring. Ruth's willingness to cooperate gave us credibility with other hospital staff who had interacted with Mom during her final days. Gladys Porter, Mom's elderly roommate, proved to be an invaluable witness because her hip surgery recovery had kept her bedridden and alert throughout the entire period of Mom's hospitalization. Mrs. Porter had observed multiple private conversations between Mom and Dad that seemed to distress Mom significantly. She remembered Mom crying after Dad's visits and attempting to use the room phone repeatedly, only to be told by nursing staff that the phone system was experiencing technical difficulties. Most importantly, Mrs. Porter had overheard part of a conversation on Christmas Eve morning where Mom begged Dad not to do this, and promised that she would keep quiet about everything if he would just let her go home. Dad's response had been too quiet for Mrs. Porter to hear clearly, but Mom had become agitated and tried to call for nursing assistance before apparently changing her mind and settling back into bed. The private investigator I had hired, Maxwell Cooper, provided crucial evidence about Dad's activities outside the hospital during Mom's final week. Maxwell's investigation revealed that Dad had met with Adriana Blackwood multiple times while Mom was hospitalized, including a lengthy dinner at an expensive restaurant on the night before Mom died. Maxwell also uncovered Dad's financial activities during this period, including large cash withdrawals, meetings with his business accountant, and contact with insurance companies about updating policy beneficiaries. The pattern suggested that Dad was preparing for significant life changes while publicly maintaining the facade of a devoted husband focused solely on his wife's recovery. Perhaps most damaging was Maxwell's discovery of Dad's travel patterns over the past 2 years. Dad's business trips, which he had always presented as necessary for expanding the insurance company, corresponded exactly with times when Adriana Blackwood had been traveling for her own work as a marketing consultant. Credit card records showed that Dad had been paying for Adriana's accommodations, meals, and expenses during these trips, essentially funding a parallel relationship while maintaining his marriage for appearance and financial purposes. The level of deception was staggering, involving false business documentation, fake client meetings, and elaborate scheduling to ensure that Adriana's pregnancy and their relationship remained hidden from family and community. Building this evidentiary foundation also meant confronting Tucker about his role in enabling Dad's crimes. Tucker's cooperation was essential because he had witnessed conversations and behaviors that outsiders couldn't access, but his guilt and fear made him initially resistant to coming forward. The breakthrough with Tucker came when I shared Dr. Chen's medical analysis with him, forcing him to confront the reality that Dad had been slowly killing Mom while Tucker stood by and watched. The evidence that Mom's death wasn't natural, combined with documentation of Dad's affair and financial crimes, finally convinced Tucker that his loyalty to Dad was misplaced. Tucker's testimony revealed the extent to which Dad had manipulated both of his children. Dad had convinced Tucker that Mom's accusations about the affair were symptoms of her mental decline, that her financial concerns were paranoid delusions, and that supporting Dad's narrative was the kindest way to handle a tragic situation. Tucker also provided details about Dad's business practices that supported the insurance fraud charges. He had accompanied Dad to client meetings where Dad had misrepresented policy terms, witnessed Dad falsifying client documentation, and heard Dad bragging about his ability to convince people to trust him with their financial security. The most difficult ally to approach was Adriana Blackwood herself. As Dad's accomplice in the affair and potentially the mother of his child, Adriana had every reason to maintain the status quo and avoid involvement in criminal proceedings. But when Maxwell Cooper approached her with evidence of Dad's pattern of murdering wives, Adriana's self-preservation instincts overcame her loyalty. Adriana revealed that Dad had been increasingly pressuring her about Mom's death, insisting that they needed to accelerate their wedding plans and relocate to a different state before anyone started asking questions about the timing of their relationship. Dad had also become possessive and controlling toward Adriana, monitoring her communications and demanding that she cut ties with friends who might ask awkward questions about her pregnancy timeline. Most disturbing was Adriana's account of Dad's reaction to Mom's death. Instead of grief or even relief, Dad had shown excitement about finally being free to pursue their relationship openly. He had talked about Mom's death as a problem that had been solved rather than a tragedy that had affected their family, and he had begun making plans for their future with a callousness that frightened Adriana. Adriana agreed to cooperate with our investigation because she had begun to fear that Dad's pattern of murdering wives might eventually include her, especially if their relationship became inconvenient or if she learned too much about his criminal activities. Her testimony would be crucial because she could provide evidence of Dad's premeditation and his deliberate planning around Mom's death. With allies inside the hospital, the legal system, and Dad's personal life, we finally had the foundation necessary to challenge his version of events and seek justice for Mom's murder. But building the case also meant accepting that our family's reputation would be destroyed, that Tucker's cooperation would make him a target for Dad's manipulation and possible retaliation, and that exposing the truth would require reliving the most painful period of our lives in public proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming, but the emotional cost of pursuing justice was staggering. We weren't just fighting to prove that Dad had committed murder. We were fighting to reclaim Mom's memory from the narrative of tragic illness that Dad had constructed to hide his crimes. With evidence compiled and allies coordinated, we needed a strategy to expose Dad's crimes in a way that would prevent him from destroying evidence or fleeing before law enforcement could act. Detective Raymond Torres of the Connecticut State Police had become involved after Mr. Sterling presented our initial findings, and Detective Torres had experience with complex domestic homicide cases involving financial fraud. Detective Torres's approach was methodical and patient, recognizing that we were dealing with someone who had successfully manipulated multiple systems for years. Rather than confronting Dad directly with our accusations, we would create opportunities for him to incriminate himself while believing he was still in control of the narrative. The plan centered around Mom's memorial service, which Dad had scheduled for 2 weeks after her death. Dad had been planning an elaborate celebration of Mom's life, inviting extended family, business associates, and community members to honor a woman they believed had died tragically but naturally. The memorial would provide cover for our investigation team to gather final evidence while giving Dad opportunities to reveal his true nature when he thought he was safely surrounded by supporters. My role in the plan required me to approach Dad with a performance of reconciliation and acceptance. I would apologize for questioning his decisions during Mom's hospitalization, acknowledge his grief and burden as a widower, and express gratitude for how he had protected me from the worst details of Mom's medical crisis. This approach was psychologically challenging because it meant temporarily rewarding Dad's manipulation while pretending to be the naive daughter he believed me to be. But Detective Torres explained that suspects like Dad often revealed crucial information when they believed their victims had been successfully manipulated and posed no threat to their constructed narrative. The first test of this strategy came when I approached Dad about Mom's cremation arrangements. Dad had been advocating for immediate cremation, explaining that Mom had expressed preferences for simple, private arrangements without lengthy funeral proceedings. When I suggested that we should wait to allow extended family time to travel and pay their respects, Dad initially resisted but eventually agreed when I framed the delay as honoring Mom's love for her family. This conversation was recorded through a wire that I wore during our discussion, and Dad's response revealed his anxiety about maintaining the body for examination while also showing his skill at manipulating family sentiment to support his preferences. He didn't explicitly object to extended funeral arrangements, but he found multiple ways to suggest that prolonging the process would be emotionally harmful for everyone involved. More significantly, Dad began discussing Mom's final days with a level of detail that contradicted his earlier claims about her unconscious state and inability to communicate with family. In trying to comfort me with stories about her peaceful final moments, Dad inadvertently provided evidence that Mom had been alert and conversational during periods when he had told me she was too sedated to recognize visitors. Tucker's cooperation was essential during this phase because Dad trusted him and often spoke more freely about family business when they were alone together. Tucker wore recording equipment during several private conversations with Dad, capturing statements about insurance procedures, financial planning, and Dad's future intentions that provided crucial evidence of premeditation and ongoing criminal activity. The most damaging recording came from a conversation where Dad discussed his timeline for settling Mom's estate and relocating to start fresh with Adriana. Dad's casual planning around Mom's death, combined with his detailed knowledge of insurance claim procedures and his eagerness to finalize financial arrangements, painted a clear picture of someone who had been preparing for his wife's death rather than grieving an unexpected loss. Adriana's role in gathering evidence required the most careful coordination because her pregnancy made her vulnerable to Dad's manipulation and potential violence if he discovered her cooperation with law enforcement. Detective Torres arranged for Adriana to wear recording equipment during planned meetings with Dad, where she would express concerns about their relationship timeline and their plans for the future. These conversations revealed Dad's complete lack of genuine emotion about Mom's death combined with his excitement about finally being free to pursue his relationship with Adriana openly. Dad discussed Mom's death as a business problem that had been resolved rather than a personal tragedy, and he showed impatience with any suggestion that they should wait before making their relationship public. Most incriminating was Dad's detailed planning around insurance proceeds and his timeline for leaving Connecticut. Dad had already been making arrangements to transfer his business assets, close bank accounts, and relocate to Florida where Adriana had been offered a new position with her marketing company. The level of preparation Dad had completed before Mom's death demonstrated clear premeditation and supported the theory that he had been planning her murder for months rather than acting impulsively during a medical crisis. Detective Torres also arranged for surveillance during Dad's meetings with Dr. Clayton Morse and other members of his support network. These conversations, recorded through court-approved wiretaps, revealed the extent to which Dad had been managing information and manipulating professional relationships to cover his crimes. Dr. Morse, who genuinely believed he had been providing appropriate medical care for Mom's diabetes, was horrified to learn that his treatment recommendations might have been used to harm rather than help his patient. When confronted with evidence of Dad's insulin manipulation, Dr. Morse immediately agreed to cooperate with the investigation and provide medical testimony about the true cause of Mom's symptoms. The trap was finally set during Mom's memorial service itself. Dad had planned the event as a celebration of Mom's life and his own role as a devoted husband who had courageously supported his wife through her final illness. Extended family, business associates, and community members gathered to offer condolences and support to a man they believed had suffered a terrible loss. But Detective Torres had positioned undercover officers throughout the gathering, and several key witnesses were prepared to observe Dad's behavior during an event where he believed he was safely surrounded by supporters. Dad's performance during the memorial would provide crucial evidence about his true emotional state and his attitude toward Mom's death. The plan was for me to give a eulogy that would subtly challenge Dad's narrative about Mom's final days while appearing to honor her memory. My speech would include details about Mom's alertness and concern for family during her hospitalization, information that contradicted Dad's claims about her unconscious state. Dad's reaction to this speech, along with his conversations with family members and business associates throughout the event, would be carefully monitored and recorded. If Dad maintained his innocent facade, we would have evidence of his deceptive abilities. If he reacted defensively or aggressively, we would have evidence of consciousness of guilt. The memorial service represented the culmination of weeks of evidence gathering and the final opportunity to document Dad's behavior before law enforcement moved to arrest him. Everything depended on Dad's continued belief that he had successfully manipulated everyone around him and that his crimes would never be discovered. But the emotional challenge of pretending to grieve alongside the man who had murdered Mom, while secretly working to expose his crimes, tested everyone involved in the investigation. We weren't just seeking justice. We were fighting to reclaim the truth about Mom's life and death from the false narrative Dad had constructed to hide his evil. The memorial service began exactly as Dad had planned, with over 200 community members gathering to honor Mom's memory and support our family during our time of grief. Dad played his role perfectly, greeting guests with dignity and appropriate sadness, accepting condolences with grace, and speaking about Mom with what appeared to be genuine love and admiration. But I could see the performance now in ways that I had missed before. Dad's grief was precisely calibrated to match what people expected to see. His stories about Mom focused on public moments rather than private intimacies, and his discussions about the future were subtly focused on moving forward rather than preserving memories. My eulogy was the first crack in Dad's carefully constructed facade. I spoke about Mom's final days with love and admiration, but I included details that contradicted the narrative Dad had been presenting to family and friends. I talked about Mom's alertness and her concern for reaching out to family members, her worry about financial matters that she wanted to discuss with me, and her expression of love for everyone who couldn't be present during her final hours. The audience received my speech as a touching tribute to a beloved wife and mother, but I watched Dad's face throughout my remarks and saw the moment when he realized that I knew more about Mom's actual condition than he had told me. His expression shifted from performative grief to genuine concern, and I could see him calculating how much I actually knew and whether his version of events was still secure. After the formal service, Dad approached me privately to suggest that grief might be affecting my memory of our conversations about Mom's condition. He gently but firmly corrected my understanding of her final days, explaining that my desire to remember Mom as alert and communicative was natural but not entirely accurate given her medical condition. This conversation was recorded through the wire I wore, and Dad's response provided clear evidence of his continued deception even when confronted with contradictory information. Rather than expressing surprise or asking questions about my different recollection of events, Dad immediately moved to discredit my account and reinforce his preferred narrative. The real confrontation came when Detective Torres approached Dad during the reception, identifying himself as a law enforcement officer investigating irregularities in Mom's medical treatment. Dad's initial reaction was perfectly appropriate, expressing willingness to cooperate with any investigation and concern about ensuring that Mom had received proper care. But when Detective Torres began asking specific questions about Dad's timeline during Mom's final night and his knowledge of her medical treatment, Dad's responses revealed knowledge that he shouldn't have possessed if his account of events was accurate. Dad provided detailed information about Mom's insulin levels, her medication schedule, and her blood sugar fluctuations that would only be available to someone who had been monitoring her condition much more closely than he had claimed. The trap finally closed when Tucker stepped forward to provide his testimony about Dad's actual activities during the period Mom was hospitalized. Tucker's account of Dad's meetings with Adriana, his discussion of insurance arrangements, and his planning for life after Mom's death directly contradicted Dad's presentation of himself as a devoted husband focused solely on his wife's recovery. Dad's reaction to Tucker's betrayal was immediate and violent. The mask of grieving widower fell away completely as Dad screamed accusations at Tucker, calling him ungrateful and threatening to destroy his life for disloyalty to family. The transformation was shocking to everyone present, revealing a person none of the memorial guests recognized. When Adriana was brought forward to provide her testimony about Dad's planning around Mom's death and his excitement about finally being free to pursue their relationship, Dad's response shifted from denial to desperate negotiation. He began offering explanations that contradicted his previous statements, suggesting that Mom had known about the affair and approved of his plans for the future. Ruth Bradford's testimony about the hospital's visiting restrictions and Dad's presence during medication administration periods provided medical evidence that supported the murder charges. Dr. Chen's analysis of Mom's blood work, combined with Dr. Morse's admission that he had been prescribing insulin based on Dad's reports rather than independent testing, created a clear picture of systematic poisoning over several months. The most devastating evidence came when Detective Torres played recordings of Dad's conversations with Adriana where he discussed Mom's death as a problem that had been solved rather than a tragedy that had affected his family. Dad's casual attitude toward Mom's suffering, combined with his detailed planning around insurance proceeds and relocation, demonstrated consciousness of guilt and premeditation. Dad's final attempt at manipulation came when he claimed that everything he had done was motivated by love for his family and desire to protect us from financial hardship. He presented his affair as a response to Mom's declining health, his insurance fraud as a way to secure our future, and even Mom's death as a merciful end to suffering that would have only gotten worse. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Dad's explanations only served to further incriminate him. His detailed knowledge of insurance policies, his preparation for Mom's death, and his immediate plans for moving forward with Adriana demonstrated that he had been planning Mom's murder for months while maintaining the performance of a devoted husband. The arrest happened in front of the entire community that had gathered to honor Mom's memory, providing a public reckoning that ensured Dad's crimes couldn't be hidden or minimized. Family members who had trusted Dad for years witnessed his complete breakdown when confronted with evidence of his true nature. Uncle Robert, Mom's brother who had traveled from California for the service, was particularly devastated by the revelation that Dad had lied to him about Mom's condition during her final days. Aunt Linda, who had wanted to travel from Oregon but was discouraged by Dad's reports that Mom's condition was minor, realized that she had been deliberately prevented from saying goodbye to her sister. The community members who had trusted Dad with their insurance needs learned that they were victims of fraud, that their financial security had been compromised by someone they had considered a friend and advisor. The scope of Dad's deception extended far beyond our family to include dozens of families who had trusted him with their most important financial decisions. Dr. Walsh, who had accommodated Dad's requests during Mom's hospitalization, faced the devastating realization that his professional judgment had been compromised by personal financial obligations. Hospital administration launched internal investigations to prevent similar manipulation of medical protocols in the future. The public nature of Dad's exposure ensured that his crimes couldn't be covered up or forgotten, but it also meant that our family's private tragedy became community knowledge. Everyone who had envied our perfect family now understood that the entire foundation had been built on lies, manipulation, and ultimately murder. As Dad was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence and claiming that he was being persecuted for loving his family too much, I felt a mixture of vindication and devastation that justice was finally being served while our family's reputation lay in ruins around us.
Dad's arrest triggered a cascade of investigations that revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise spanning over 15 years. The insurance fraud charges alone involved over 60 families who had paid premiums for policies that either didn't exist or provided dramatically less coverage than what they had purchased. The financial damage exceeded $2.3 million, representing life savings and retirement funds that Dad had systematically stolen from trusting clients. The murder charges were more complex to prosecute because Dad had been careful to use methods that mimicked natural medical complications. However, the combination of Dr. Chen's toxicology analysis, medical records showing inappropriate insulin administration, and recorded evidence of Dad's premeditation provided prosecutors with a strong case for first-degree murder. Tucker's cooperation with the prosecution was essential but emotionally devastating for our family. His testimony about Dad's manipulation, his knowledge of the affair with Adriana, and his witness to conversations about insurance arrangements provided crucial evidence of premeditation. But Tucker also faced potential charges for his role in enabling Dad's fraud, and his plea bargain required him to testify against our father while accepting responsibility for his own criminal negligence. The psychological impact on Tucker was severe. He had spent years believing that he was protecting family interests by supporting Dad's narrative, only to learn that his loyalty had enabled Mom's murder. Tucker's testimony during the trial was heartbreaking, as he described the gradual process by which Dad had convinced him that lying to Mom about financial matters was necessary to protect her from stress during her illness. Adriana's situation was particularly complicated because she was both a victim of Dad's manipulation and a potential accomplice in his crimes. Her pregnancy made her vulnerable, but her cooperation with the investigation was essential for understanding Dad's motivations and timeline. The prosecution ultimately granted Adriana immunity in exchange for her testimony, recognizing that she had been manipulated by someone with far more experience in deception and control. Adriana's testimony revealed the extent to which Dad had been planning Mom's murder while simultaneously planning his future with another woman. Her account of Dad's excitement about being finally free after Mom's death, combined with his detailed discussions about insurance proceeds and relocation plans, provided clear evidence that he had viewed Mom's life as an obstacle to be removed rather than a relationship to be honored. The hospital faced significant liability for its role in enabling Dad's manipulation during Mom's final days. While individual staff members like Ruth Bradford were recognized as heroes for ultimately cooperating with the investigation, the institution itself had allowed protocols to be circumvented in ways that facilitated murder. Dr. Walsh lost his medical license and faced criminal charges for his role in accommodating Dad's requests without proper medical justification. His financial relationship with Dad created conflicts of interest that compromised his professional judgment, and his failure to conduct appropriate testing during Mom's hospitalization constituted medical malpractice that contributed to her death. Medical examiner Beatrice Crane was arrested for falsifying death certificates and accepting bribes to expedite processing of suspicious deaths. Her cooperation with Dad's timeline requirements had prevented proper investigation of Mom's death and potentially enabled him to commit additional murders. The revelation that Dad had previously been married to Savannah Mitchell, who died under similar circumstances in Massachusetts, led to the reopening of that case and additional murder charges. Lillian's death had been attributed to complications from lupus, but toxicology analysis of preserved tissue samples revealed insulin levels consistent with deliberate poisoning. Dad's pattern of targeting women with medical conditions, isolating them from family support systems, and gradually poisoning them while maintaining the appearance of devoted caregiver became clear through investigations in multiple states. Prosecutors estimated that Dad might have been responsible for as many as 5 deaths over a 20-year period, each involving similar methods and motivations. The trial itself was emotionally grueling for everyone involved. Dad maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that he was being persecuted by ungrateful children who couldn't accept their mother's natural death. His defense strategy focused on portraying him as a devoted husband whose grief had been twisted into criminal accusations by family members seeking to blame someone for their loss. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical testimony about insulin poisoning, financial records documenting fraud and affair-related expenses, recorded conversations revealing Dad's true attitudes toward Mom's death, and witness accounts of his manipulative behavior created an incontrovertible case for premeditated murder. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and medical abuse. Dad's reaction to the verdict was characteristic of his personality throughout our lives. He expressed no remorse for his crimes, only anger at being caught and punished. The sentencing phase provided an opportunity for victim impact statements from family members and fraud victims who had been affected by Dad's crimes. I spoke about Mom's love for her family and her efforts to protect us from Dad's manipulation even while she was being systematically poisoned. Tucker described his guilt about enabling Dad's crimes and his commitment to honoring Mom's memory through truthfulness and accountability. Most powerfully, Ruth Bradford spoke about the obligation healthcare workers have to protect patients from harm, and her determination to never again allow professional protocols to be manipulated by someone seeking to commit crimes. Her courage in ultimately coming forward had been essential for exposing Dad's methods and preventing similar tragedies. Dad received life imprisonment without possibility of parole for Mom's murder, along with additional sentences for the fraud convictions and charges related to Lillian Mitchell's death. The judge specifically noted the calculated nature of Dad's crimes and his complete lack of remorse as factors supporting the maximum possible sentence. The financial restitution process took over 2 years to complete, but ultimately most of the fraud victims recovered significant portions of their losses through insurance company settlements and seizure of Dad's assets. The process of rebuilding trust in local insurance services took much longer, as the community struggled with the reality that someone they had trusted with their financial security had been systematically betraying that trust. For our family, the legal resolution provided closure but not healing. Tucker and I had to rebuild our relationship while processing the complex trauma of learning that our father was a murderer who had manipulated us into enabling his crimes. The grief of losing Mom was complicated by anger at Dad's deception, guilt about not recognizing the signs of abuse, and shame about our family's public destruction. The community response was mixed but ultimately supportive. While some people struggled to understand how we could have missed signs of Dad's true nature, most recognized that we were victims of sophisticated manipulation rather than willing accomplices. The revelation that Dad had deceived professional colleagues and community leaders helped people understand that his deception wasn't something that untrained family members could have easily detected. The justice achieved through Dad's conviction provided validation that Mom's death hadn't been natural and that her suffering had been recognized and addressed through legal accountability. But justice couldn't restore the years of happiness that Dad's manipulation had stolen from our family or bring back the mother whose love had been repaid with calculated cruelty. 3 years have passed since Dad's conviction, and I'm still learning how to rebuild a life shaped by trauma, betrayal, and ultimately, the pursuit of justice. The healing process has been neither linear nor predictable, involving periods of rage, profound sadness, unexpected hope, and gradual acceptance that some wounds change us permanently rather than disappearing completely. Therapy became essential for processing the complex emotions involved in discovering that the father I had trusted and admired was actually a calculating murderer who had spent years manipulating our entire family. The therapeutic work involved not just grieving Mom's loss, but also grieving the loss of the father I thought I had known and the family structure that had never been as loving or secure as I had believed. One of the most difficult aspects of healing was learning to trust my own judgment again. Dad's manipulation had been so thorough and long-term that I questioned every memory, every assumption, and every relationship in my life. If I could be so completely deceived about someone I lived with for 25 years, how could I trust my ability to recognize truth or identify people who might harm me? Working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a therapist who specializes in trauma from family violence, helped me understand that Dad's manipulation had been sophisticated enough to fool medical professionals, legal authorities, and business associates who had much more experience recognizing deception than I did. The fact that I had eventually uncovered the truth and fought for justice demonstrated strength and insight rather than naivety. Tucker's healing journey has been even more complicated because his guilt about enabling Dad's crimes was compounded by legal consequences and public scrutiny. His plea bargain required community service and financial restitution, but more challenging was rebuilding relationships with family members who struggled to forgive his role in protecting Dad's secrets. Our relationship as siblings had to be completely reconstructed based on honesty rather than the family loyalty that Dad had used to manipulate both of us. Tucker's decision to seek his own therapy and participate in support groups for family members of criminal offenders helped him develop tools for managing guilt while taking responsibility for his choices. The process of forgiveness between Tucker and me took over 2 years and required both of us to accept that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing harmful behavior. Tucker had made choices that enabled Mom's death, but those choices were made under manipulation by someone with decades more experience in psychological control. Adriana's situation remained complex throughout the legal proceedings and beyond. She gave birth to a daughter, Emma, who is technically my half-sister despite the circumstances of her conception. Adriana moved across the country to start fresh, but she has maintained contact with our family because she believes Emma deserves to know about her extended family history when she's old enough to understand. Meeting Emma for the first time was emotionally overwhelming. She carries physical resemblances to both Dad and Mom, representing both the continuation of our family line and a living reminder of the destruction Dad caused. Adriana has been thoughtful about how to eventually explain Emma's father's crimes while protecting her from unnecessary trauma, and our family has committed to supporting Emma's well-being regardless of our complicated history. The financial aspects of recovery took years to resolve but ultimately provided resources for healing and advocacy work. Mom's life insurance proceeds, combined with restitution from Dad's criminal asset seizure, created opportunities to honor Mom's memory through meaningful projects rather than just surviving the aftermath of trauma. I established the Savannah Mitchell Foundation for Family Safety, focusing on education about financial abuse, medical manipulation, and the warning signs of domestic violence that extend beyond physical harm. The foundation provides resources for families dealing with complex abuse situations and advocates for better training for healthcare professionals, legal authorities, and financial institutions about recognizing manipulation tactics. The advocacy work has been personally healing because it transforms the pain of our experience into tools for protecting other families from similar tragedies. Speaking at conferences about domestic violence and financial fraud has connected me with other survivors who understand the complex emotions involved in loving someone who ultimately betrayed that love through criminal behavior. Working with Dr. Chen, the endocrinologist whose testing revealed the truth about Mom's condition, I've become involved in developing medical protocols for recognizing signs of deliberate poisoning in patients with chronic conditions. Healthcare professionals now receive better training about family dynamics that might indicate abuse, and hospitals have implemented stronger safeguards against manipulation of patient communication and treatment decisions. My relationship with Maxwell Cooper, the private investigator who helped gather evidence against Dad, evolved into a romantic partnership that has taught me how to recognize healthy love versus manipulative control. Max understands the importance of transparency, independence, and mutual respect in ways that feel completely different from the possessive, controlling behavior I grew up thinking was normal family protection. Building trust with Max required learning to recognize the difference between someone who supports your growth and someone who seeks to limit your autonomy. Max encouraged my advocacy work, supported my decision to testify in other cases involving family violence, and respected my need for independence while offering partnership rather than control. The garden where Mom used to find peace has become a memorial space that provides both beauty and therapeutic value. I've learned to tend the roses she planted, creating a living reminder of her strength and love that existed despite Dad's attempts to destroy her spirit. The garden represents continuity, growth, and the possibility of creating something beautiful even after experiencing profound loss. Returning to school to pursue a degree in social work was part of rebuilding my sense of purpose and direction. The coursework in family systems, trauma recovery, and victim advocacy provided both personal healing and professional preparation for helping other families navigate complex abuse situations. The most profound wisdom I've gained is understanding that healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before trauma occurred. Instead, healing involves integrating painful experiences into a stronger, more compassionate version of yourself that can recognize both danger and hope with greater clarity. I've learned that love never requires you to doubt your own perceptions, accept isolation from support systems, or surrender control over your own medical care, financial security, or personal relationships. Healthy love encourages growth, independence, and connection with others rather than creating dependence and isolation. The anniversary of Mom's death each Christmas Eve has become a time for reflection rather than pure grief. I visit her grave not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was preserved through the pursuit of truth and justice. Her courage in gathering evidence despite her fear, her love for family even while being betrayed, and her hope for protection from future harm continue to inspire the advocacy work that honors her memory. The most important lesson I can share is that trusting your instincts about people who claim to love you is not disloyal or ungrateful. If someone's behavior makes you feel confused, isolated, or afraid, those feelings deserve attention and investigation rather than dismissal. Love should make you feel more secure and confident, not more vulnerable and dependent. Mom's final letter, which I still read when I need strength, reminds me that she fought for truth even when it was dangerous and painful. Her courage in gathering evidence and seeking help, despite Dad's manipulation and control, ultimately made justice possible and protected other potential victims from experiencing similar tragedies. Today, I'm proud to carry forward Mom's legacy of courage, love, and protection for family while building a life based on honesty, independence, and genuine connection with others. The pain of losing her and discovering Dad's betrayal will always be part of my story, but it's not the end of the story. Healing has created space for hope, growth, and the possibility of preventing similar tragedies for other families. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate has taught me that the most powerful response to betrayal and trauma is not revenge or hatred, but the commitment to truth, justice, and protection for others who might face similar dangers. Mom's love continues through the work of ensuring that other mothers, daughters, and families have the resources and support they need to recognize danger and seek help before it's too late. What questions do you have about recognizing signs of manipulation in relationships? Have you ever felt like something was wrong in your family but couldn't quite put your finger on what it was? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your experiences might help someone else recognize warning signs before it's too late. Please like this video if Mom's story touched your heart, subscribe for more stories about finding strength through adversity, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how domestic abuse can hide behind perfect family facades. Thank you for listening to Mom's story and helping ensure that her courage in seeking truth continues to protect other families. May you find the strength to trust your instincts and the courage to seek help when something doesn't feel right in your relationships.